What is the nature of Hanukkah and gender? As a practical matter, the modern celebration of Hanukkah with Mahadran Mina Mahadran, this notion that each and every person lights their own Chanukiah, and the centering of the ritual in the home as opposed to in the synagogue, although there's a lighting in the synagogue, it's much more minor on the holiday of Hanukkah compared to the lighting in the home. So what this all does is it creates, in effect, a fully egalitarian ceremony and ritual where all members of the household, regardless of age, gender, or other distinguishing features, are participating in the same way. Now, the Talmudic account of it doesn't have the same sense. Ner ish uveto, the obligation to light falls upon the man and his household. And yet in practice, of course, it is not centrally seen as a man's obligation, but as a shared obligation among all the members of the household. But what is the source that women are obligated to light Hanukkah candles? After all, in classic Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism, any time-bound positive commandment, mitzvahs, aseh man grama, women are exempted from. And so in what sense, why, how, what are the mechanics of women being obligated to light the Hanukkah candles? Not unlike Purim, the Talmud quotes a theory for women's obligation. The theory is only used, it should be noted, for rabbinic commandments like Purim and Hanukkah. It isn't generally applied to biblical commandments. And the theory is called Afhin Hayu Be'oto Hanes, that they too, women too, were included in the miracle. Now, there are two views of what this means. The first view is simply that women also were included in the miracle during the time of Esther. Both men and women were in danger of being killed by Achashverosh, Haman, and their armies, and everyone was saved. And so everyone who was saved is equally obligated in the celebration of the holiday. And since gender was not a factor in the level of danger, gender is not a distinguishing feature of the rabbinic obligation to celebrate, even though it normally would be. This principle overrides that. And so too in Hanukkah, Afhin Hayu Be'oto Hanes, in this version of it would simply mean that the Hellenization of the Jews and the decrees against observance fell equally upon the entire populace. It was a threat to the whole of Judaism and not to Jewish men. And so as a result, everyone is obligated to celebrate. But there is another more compelling version, though it's harder to fit into the words Afhein Haybotonis. Even they were included in the miracle. It makes it sound like women were an afterthought, but there's another version quoted in the Tosafos that is more surprising, though it fits the features of the stories well, and that's that women were the protagonists and the saviors in these holidays. And so women are obligated to celebrate in positive time-bound commandments because in many ways, these are women's holidays, not unlike Rosh Chodesh has been kind of claimed as a woman's holiday. How so? So for Purim, it's somewhat obvious. Esther, the heroine of the story, is not just a woman, just happened to be a woman, but Esther uses distinct features of her femininity, enticing the king, marrying him, deceiving him, tempting him, in order to save the Jewish people. And so it's specifically the fact that she was a woman and then the queen that led to the whole story in the first place. Were Esther not born a woman, the story may never have happened. But what about Hanukkah? The classic dual domains of Hanukkah are both male. The military battlefield was Mattathias, and the Maccabees, presumably it was the men who were mainly the armed soldiers, and the miracle of the oil, if we want to go down that route, related to the Kohanim, the priests, also Maccabees, but it's a separate discussion. But the temple realm was certainly, and the priesthood in the temple was certainly a male domain. And so both of these realms, the temple and the battlefield, are both classically and in fact were male. And so where do we see women acting as protagonists in the Hanukkah story? I wanted to offer two possibilities for this sixth night of Hanukkah. The first relates to the description of Hannah, the daughter of Mattathias, in the books of Maccabees. And there, a fascinating scene is described, and Lori Hope Lefkowitz actually describes both this and the next thing I'll quote in her fascinating book, In Scripture, The First Stories of Jewish Sexual Identities. So Hannah, and we studied this a couple of years ago, actually, on our Nitzelnacht study as well, if people remember when we did a study of Judith. So Hannah there is married. And as you may have been aware, there was a rule, quoted in some Mel Brooks movies as well, that virgins were required to sleep with the king or the political ruler as part of the marriage rite. And so there Hannah is getting married, and she's under the chuppah, and she removes her clothes and strips naked. And in this scene, her family is very embarrassed by her actions, and she flips the script and chastises them, noting that they're embarrassed by her nakedness, and yet somehow they have no shame that she's going to be raped. And invoking Dinah, she asks where their sense of pride is and where their loyalties are, that they have no shame about what is about to happen to her and other Jewish women at the hands of the Syrian Greeks. What's interesting is the sort of sense of irony in the story. Nakedness is supposed to be associated with a sense of shame, and so ostensibly she's the one who should be ashamed, and she's the woman, but she flips the sense of shame she is supposed to have, and instead uses that shame as a sense of armor. Though she's not clothed in clothing, she's in fact assuming a very classically male or stereotypically male role, one of aggressivity and effectually launching an attack and exposing the disempowered, even castrated nature of the men, the Jewish men, the ones who are supposed to be in charge, who are sitting there allowing this to happen with pretend fake shame and armor, and yet they're defenseless, being almost, I don't mean to use the word in this way, but assaulted, sexually assaulted, or even raped in a sense by the Greeks. And so she's flipped the whole dynamic. And so that's one possibility, is Hannah, the daughter of Mattathias, Afhein Hayuba Osoanes, she becomes a protagonist in the story. And there is a related femme fatale, Judith and Khalafaris, though the book of Judith, apocryphal, doesn't classically say anything about Hanukkah. The rabbis came to associate her actions as happening on Hanukkah. And in case you're not familiar with the story, the city is under siege, and Judith has been in mourning after the death of her husband, a widow. She's been wearing sackcloth, and she hasn't dressed herself up. She hasn't, maintained rituals of beautification. And she decides, with great piety and zeal in the book of Judith, when you read it, you see that the zealousy in her prayers and in her actions is extreme and captivating in certain ways. And she decides she's going to do something about this supposedly invincible general Holofernes, and she is going to defeat him It says, I'll quote you, she removed the sackcloth which she had been wearing and took off her widow's garments and bathed her body in water and anointed herself with precious ointment, combed her hair, put on a tiara, etc. The ones which she used to wear while her husband Menashe was living. She put sandals on her feet and put on her anklets and bracelets and rings and her earrings and all her ornaments and made herself very beautiful to entice the eyes of all men who might see her. Under cover of night, she sneaks out of the city and she convinces sentries and guards who meet her from the enemy that she's defecting, that she knows the Jews are doomed, and that she wants to go to Khalafaris, the general, in order to give secrets so that she might aid in defeat, seeing the writing on the wall. Push comes to shove, and she and her servant are eventually admitted to the tent of Khalafaris, who becomes intoxicated, hence the linkage of wine and also cheese and dairy on Hanukkah, even though dairy is not mentioned in the story, but wine is kind of associated with dairy or inserted into the story, as it were. And so wine and cheese become elements of Hanukkah, mentioned even in the Ramah as part of the Sudos, the festive meals that are to happen. But what does she do? She then pulls a Yael, kind of a doppelganger, and beheads Khalafaris, which became famous in a couple of different pieces of art, beheading him and taking his head and putting it on a stick and coming back, and this representing a great victory for the Jews. Here too, Judith pretends the role of classic, quote unquote, female, as it were, yes, this role of passivity, of beauty. She dresses up, and the text goes into some great detail about what's entailed, but the whole time her intention has nothing to do with the supposed sexual temptation, which is attributed to her. She has a militaristic goal from the outset to entice in order to kill and defeat. And she employs these tools like a game. And it is the men who are supposed to be strong and strong-willed here, who are here displayed like Khalafaris as weak and feeble-minded, easily giving in to temptation, right? Kind of a reverse Eve stereotype, as it were. Whereas Judith is cunning, perhaps more like the snake, playing the role of the snake. So it's interesting to see the roles flipped. So back to Hanukkah and gender for a moment, bearing in mind the examples of Hannah and Judith, I wanted to introduce to you or make you aware of a tradition which you may or may not have been familiar with. It's really a Tunisian custom, although some Moroccan communities as well, though it's becoming more and more popular in recent years, and that's Eid al-Banot, or I don't know if I said that correctly, I don't speak Arabic, or Chag al-Banot, a festival of the daughters. There was in Tunisian, North African communities, a festival for sons, Chag al-Banim, on Shabbat of Parshat Yitro, and there's a concomitant or partner festival, Chag al-Banot, for daughters for women on the sixth night of Hanukkah, celebrating, and that's because it's right after Rosh Chodesh, so it's the first day of the month, Rosh Chodesh typically being associated in certain ways with women. And so now it's the new month of Tevet, and so it's Chag Habanot. It's a festival, a full-blown festival for women, and particularly for daughters, celebrating Hannah, Judith, and perhaps other female heroines of Jewish history. I wanted to make you aware of that practice and cause hopefully some reflection about themes of gender, politics, sex, power, alcohol, food, all of it as it relates to Hanukkah, perhaps Jews, and how we work with those stereotypes, how we assign them to people in certain ways, and how people, particularly Jewish women, are historically capable of flipping the script.